Welcome to Heathen Talk episode 13. Today we are talking about Canadian Heathenry. We have a special pre-recorded interview, first time for that, and two special guests today. Before we get into anything, I want to remind you all to go to our Facebook page, facebook.com/heathentalk, our website, heathentalk.com. Our Patreon is really important. It helps us get better equipment, pay for hosting, those sorts of things. And for those of you who have already donated, I'm working on your audio Havamals. I will have at least the first chapter out to you by the 15th of October. Also, our T-Chip, where you can pick up our T-shirt, go figure, which is tchip.com/heathentalk. It's our logo shirt. Support the show, wear an awesome shirt. Who doesn't want to do that? And we have some exciting updates at facebook.com/Cascadiamoot. For those of you on the West Coast who are willing to take the trip out, please go there, check us out, and wow, can't brain. Go to the Facebook, check us out, and if you can, register so that we can make an awesome event happen for Heathens in the Northwest. Tonight, we are toasting someone special. Toby, who are we toasting?
So the toast tonight goes out to Eric Lacharity. He is going to be featured tonight in a pre-recorded interview, a first for Heathen Talk. Eric was instrumental in getting this particular event up, or this particular show up and running. He's the one who got us connected with our guest host, or our guest tonight, and he's really wanted to be on the show. Unfortunately, work and other things occurred, so he wasn't able to make it. So before we start the toast, let's just kind of go through our normal tradition, or what are we drinking? So why don't we start with one of our guests, Austin Lawrence, who we'll be introducing a little bit later on in the show. What are you drinking, Austin?
I'm drinking Lingonberry Mead.
Homebrew?
Sounds delicious.
All right. And Martin Heitshu, did I get that right?
Yep, that's right. I'm drinking green tea with rosemary and lemon.
Very nice. Josh, what are you drinking?
I'm drinking Ninkasi Oktoberfest.
Okay. Thorin?
To get a better view of Josh's label, I'm also drinking Ninkasi Oktoberfest. Complete coincidence.
So I went for the cliche, and tonight I am drinking a very local brew, Woodland Empire's Moondog, complete with Ridiculous Viking on the label. So let's go ahead and raise our glasses to Eric. Thank you for putting the show together. Hail.
Hail, Eric.
And that actually brings us into our first segment. On Sunday, I had the option of speaking with Eric in regards to his major project in heathenry. That's Frankish Heathenry. And if you give us just a second, he'll be on to talk to us about Frankish Heathenry. I want to thank everybody for joining us, and let's go ahead and introduce Eric. Eric Lacharity is a Franco-Ontarian husband and father of two. He has been heathen since 2007 and co-founded Runeteer Kindred in 2008. He was a law speaker of his kindred from 2010 to 2013, and after a major reorganization of Runeteer's social structure, he is now the steward of Erichheim, a Frankish hearth confederated under the Runeteer banner. He co-organizes Hail and Horn Gathering with Austin Lawrence of Ravensknoll since 2011. He is a passionate reconstructionist of Frankish Heathenry since 2009, and in 2011 founded Thea Frankis Alcido.
Close.
Close?
Yeah.
So,
Definitely.
Eric, thank you for joining us. I appreciate
Thank you for having me.
Mm-hmm. So let's just get to the very meat and bones of this. What is Frankish Heathenry?
Frankish Heathenry is a specific branch of heathenry that focuses largely between the
I'd say the 3rd and the 8th century of Francia. Predominantly, my main area of focus with the Frankish Heathenry is roughly between the 5th and the 7th century, late 5th, late 7th, so focusing on the Merovingians. And the idea is that, from the various written sources, from the archaeological sources and so on, we can get a very approximate view of what religion looked like in the time of the Franks, in the time of the Merovingians. I understand that, in 481, Clovis converted to Christianity, but that doesn't change the fact that up until, I'd say, the waning of the Merovingians, there was still a lot of, a lot of the histories and legal codes and so on, which were compiled largely in the 8th and 9th century, still show vestiges of heathen religiosity. So the idea is to reconstruct and retro-engineer some of these sources backwards to fit a bit more into that time frame between, I'd say, the 3rd and the 5th century. It's very doable. We have a lot of sources, and luckily, because of the the vestiges of the late Western Roman Empire's chanceries and so on, we have a manuscript tradition which left us a wealth of knowledge. And there's a lot of really good academics out there today who've built their entire careers around reconstructing various aspects of Frankish society, most notably Alexander Callender Murray, who also wrote Germanic Kinship Structures, which is a phenomenal book. It's a great book for any heathen, especially anybody who's moving towards continental heathenry in general. And when I started, or what brought me to starting this, is in 2009. I joined AL. I started getting interested more in reconstruction, and I was looking for somewhere to. Pardon me.
AL, Asa True Lore.
Yeah, Asa True Lore. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
And yeah, and I decided to try and find my way or specialize in something, because I'm a firm believer that we don't need people who are jacks of all trades. We need people who are focusing on a specific and intimate area within the larger under the larger heathen umbrella, so that way you have people you can go to when you need to find stuff, look stuff up. It's good to have a go-to guy or a go-to gal to find things. So anyways, I joined there, and I decided, you know what, everybody's doing this Anglo-Saxon thing, but my family, as far as I can trace back 1574, we're from France. And so I started digging a bit more in the history around where we came from and so on, and long story short, there was a very strong Frankish and Merovingian presence, obviously, in the area of the Loire. And I said, you know what, there's probably other heathens out there, or heathen aspirants, who would like to dig into their own possible family heathen or family backgrounds or ancestral backgrounds. And being somebody, if you're somebody from Frankish descent or Francophone, to me it only makes sense that you would want to go in that direction. I'm not saying you have to. I'm not getting all metagenic-y here and all, but the idea is that we all know that language is the largest identifier or conveyor of worldview, and given that people who are francophones or people who live in places that were settled by the French, obviously there's vestiges of that in their own culture. So it's a lot easier to work from, and I think it's a noble cause for sure.
Okay. So a couple of questions on that before we move on. You say there's a lot of sources and that there's a lot of these kind of reconstruction of aspects of Frankish culture through these sources. Can you give me like an example? Like, do you have a go-to example of one of these
So this is from Roman to Merovingian Gaul. As you can see, there's a lot of bathroom bookmarks in here.
Mhm.
It is my go-to. It starts with Sidonius and ends more or less with Einhard, and it brings you all various facets, and it's by Alexander Callender Murray, and it's definitely my primary go-to.
Okay. Okay, and can you give us like a like when I say example, I'm not just talking about the sources. Is there like an aspect of Frankish culture that we've got a handle on that we can reconstruct? Like, I always go to the third O in Proto-European, how we linguists said, hey, there has to be an O sound here if our understanding of linguistic laws are correct, and then they found it in the, I believe, Urgic archaeological finds later on. So,
Yeah.
Do you have anything along those lines that you can share with us?
Yeah, I mean, if you're looking at the evidence, throughout the various sources, one of the primary places or primary sources that one goes to, in my case, is definitely the Lexalica. So that's the Law of the Franks, and or the Law Code of the Franks. It is largely built on, or largely modeled after Roman civil law, but it's a Germanic law code, and there's some some laws in there that if you scratch the surface on them, example, there's one about the theft of a pig which has been dedicated. Okay, but doesn't give anything else about it. But then if we look at other sources or other academics such as Eduardo Fabro or the like, who kind of takes the approach that there was I hate to say it, but a Vannic component to early Merovingian or early Frankish religion, and so when you follow kind of these tendrils that go back in time from law codes to historical. From archaeology to various histories, can pretty much put your finger on the fact that at some point in time, people were, dedicating swine to a deity, and the theft of that swine costs you far more than the theft of any other swine. Therefore, it was probably, dedicated for some type of slaughter or ritual ceremony of some sort.
The law codes for us have largely been late Christians railing against certain heathen practices so that we could, all right, this is now, masking is outlawed in York during Yule. So now we know that, oh, there was some sort of guising there, and the 12 days of Yule, that leads us to support this particular theory. Do you see that in the law codes, Lexalica?
A couple of places. One of them is against what they call the herbergium, which is like against witches. And one of those things was, if you poison somebody, if you give somebody a concoction and they die, then therefore you've cursed them. Therefore you must, suffer either trial by ordeal or some sort. And but at the same time, you're like, how much of this was, blown out of proportion, and if you kind of dig more into the actual law itself, what they're really saying, or what I seem to think they're saying, is that, if you give something a concoction and they die, then you're a witch. But if you give somebody a concoction and they're fine, well, then you're probably some type of healer of some sort, or an early doctor or whatever. So. But for Frankish heathenry, and specifically, the system that I've been, or the tradition that I've been developing, called Sido, which means the old Frankish custom, not so much concerned with those aspects. The number one concern is, on society. How did society function? What were the relationships between people? The power struggles, the power structures, and it's much more important, in my view, to know how people function rightly with each other, than necessarily, who they were sacrificing to or offering to. Because let's face it, the Franks, by the time the Franks became the Franks, which was a confederation of various smaller tribal groups, and some of these tribal groups were either Germanic, possibly Gallic, Gallo-Germanic, and so on. Some of them were probably Arians, some of them were probably already early Catholics, but that's what we have for the Franks, right? That's who they were. They were a mixed culture. And so what I'm interested in is, how did all these people get along? How did they find compromises in their different customary laws to come up with a larger, more national common law to maintain their hegemony, specifically around the Merovingians? So, there's a lot of people that say, well, in Gregory's histories, he talks about how apparently, Clovis worshipped Saturn and Jupiter and Mercury and Mars. Maybe he did. Maybe he was all up into the Roman stuff, right? Who knows? We don't know that aspect, but what we do know largely is the functions of some of these gods. And so for me, if a person is a Frankish heathen, and they, somehow, decide they want to worship a Frankish Mars, that's perfectly fine. What we're doing is or what I'm doing specifically, and others have kind of picked at it a bit. What I'm doing is I'm reconstructing Frankish heathenry, not token German heathenry. So I'm not trying to pick apart and pull apart and sift through all these various things that made up the Franks. If not, I'm no longer reconstructing Frankish heathenry. I'm trying to reconstruct Bructerian heathenry or Sicambrian heathenry.
Okay.
There was a very big impact and influence on the Franks from the Romans. Let's not forget, when the Franks, or when various Frankish tribes under the Salians and then becoming Merovingians came down to northern Gaul, from Toxandria and Thuringia and those places, they weren't entering a wasteland. There were Gallo-Romans there. It was no different than some I'll say mob bosses moving into a neighborhood and saying, okay, we're the new bosses now. You're gonna pledge fealty to us. Obviously, when you go into, and there were colonial people. When they came into northern Gaul, they brought their customs with them, but at the same time there were institutions there, administrative institutions that were largely centered around various churches, monasteries, and so on, but also various paguses and civitas, where they couldn't just come in and expropriate everybody, right? And they needed the Gallo-Romans to produce food for them. Let's not forget, the Franks were a martial people. They largely, we hear about them here or there, in the various law codes, having orchards and doing some farming, but that wasn't primarily their main concern. That was largely Gallo-Romans that were doing. I mean, I forget who threw the number out. I believe it's Murray, but something along the lines that when the Franks came, they were at most 10% of the population of northern Gaul. So it was a new caste that was coming in over top of what was already there. Unlike, from what I understand, with the with England, where there was that vacuum there, and there were obviously some Gallic peoples that were there, or Brittonic peoples that were there, but the Romans had largely ditched the area, and but that wasn't the case. The Franks fought their way into deeper and deeper into northern and southern Gaul. I mean, Julian did move various groups here and there, set up federates here and there, and so it was a real pastiche. But in the end, the Franks, when the Merovingians came, there was already a system that was in place, so they had to slightly modify the system to their own needs. One great example of this is when it came to gifting, but when it came to gifting estates and so on. A lot of the estates were already settled, and although it did happen at times where they would pluck off the tenants there and place somebody else, largely what normally happened was after they conquered new territory, and some of those people fled, and they gained new territory, well, instead of just giving it to them, they would give people tax breaks. So, because you have to think about how do you, if you have a large burgeoning, there wasn't an idea, there was no large cohesive army, but, various counts, various dukes had their own retainers, and those retainers not only swore their fealty to their counts, but they also swore their fealty to the king, who a lot of them would never meet. But that being said, if various kings or counts wanted to give a gift of land, typically what they had to do was give immunization from the taxes on that land, and that's the best they could do, because a lot of those lands were still needed to produce food for the fisc.
Mm-hmm.
So it wasn't a do what you want.
All right, that makes sense. And that actually, and again, thank you for bringing that up, because the idea of sacral kingship is big in Frankish heathenry, and I'd like to kind of go to that direction. Can you talk about kingship as it developed under the Franks?
Well, kingship as it developed under the Franks, I mean, not to get too deep into it, largely what we're told happened is that you had a lot of different groups here and there that were fighting against Rome. I mean, examples of such, we hear in the Liber Historia Francorum that, there was 3 chieftains, by the name of Marcomer, Sono, and Genabod, and that they were fighting against another Frank who was a general in the Roman, in a Roman army, and obviously Abragastus, who was a Frank, knew the Frankish territories, and so it was difficult. And in the end, long story short, according to the tradition, that Marcomer had decided, you know what, we need one king to rule everybody, and that king should be my son, Pharamond. And I could get into the personhood of Pharamond a little more, but the idea is that it developed out of a need, and I believe that need was to have somebody who could be viewed against the Romans as somebody of an equal. And at the same time, if you look at Clovis, Clovis was made Augustus as well, recognized apparently as an Augustus and consul by Gregory. Well, not by Gregory, but Gregory mentions that. So he uses a lot of terms that are Romanized terms for the kings of the Franks, Rex and so on, like the Rex Francorum. And the idea was that to have one family, one divine, legitimate family who could unite, the hegemony of, larger Francia. But the fact of the matter is that under, the Salic traditional laws or customary laws, each son had to have a part of the kingdom. Kingdoms were largely subdivided. Fratricide, patricide, and so on was rampant. I mean, Clovis is a great example of that. Anybody who was remotely related to him, he killed. And just went to prove how ruthless he was, and that the idea was that we must maintain, the one Frankish nation for all Franks. Sounds good on paper, but that's apparently what the goal was, and they were quite successful, all the way up into the Carolingians, the Capetians, and so on. Mm-hmm. But sacral kingship came out of necessity, and it became a hereditary, divine. One could almost say blood right, but I wouldn't go that far. I mean, there was a lot of conditions to being king. In the Frankish Calcido, the way I view things is that, because Frankish heathenry is it's a civic tradition, and what I mean by that is that it's based on, that there was a civic administrative institution. We had persons such as the missi, counts, various judicials, officiants, and so on, and that was important. You can't keep, such a large territory together without some type of administrative machine. And so, because they're focused largely on social interactions, kinship structures. How did the king relate to his counts? How did the count relate to the barons, and to the his retainers and so on. Because of that, the whole thing is really being a pie cut up in a million different pieces. To stitch that together, you need common customs and common laws. And so, Frankish heathenry is a lawful society, full of laws, specific laws, and because ethnicity was also fluid, it can change over time. A person could be a Roman but a Frank by birth, a Frank but a Roman by birth. That had, that changed compensations and so on. And so, the way that I see it is that if you embark yourself and you fulfill and you live by these laws, to however extent we can in the modern world, then you're entering the stream of that ancient tradition. And I view the Franks as being, the perfection. That is the goal I'm working at. Everything that came before or after was almost Frank, or no longer, quite as Frankish as before, focusing largely on the Merovingians. And so, in that view, and we have one situation, I believe it was under Chilperic, where there was a bishop who lost his bishopric because the other bishops decided they didn't want him anymore. And he appealed to Chilperic saying, your father granted me this bishopric, and there is a charter. And because that charter is written down, and we can still point to it, it's the word of your father still stands. So the way I see it is that the king, although the king is dead, the king's power, his mund is still, his recht is still, ubiquitous throughout the people. And so, in essence, then, we still can today, and this is, going to, probably rock a lot of people's world when I mention this, but even though the king is dead, once we resurrect his law and we live by his law, he gains that much more life. And so the king goes from being dead to hidden as the gods, as hidden as the whites and the ancestors, and the god, the Goda, the Wita, and so on. And and this kind of works into kind of have this myth or mythic structure going on, kind of like the Wild Hunt, where we do know that the Merovingian kings traveled from estate to estate, and not just from Einhard. We know they traveled from estate to estate throughout the year to feed their armies, and by doing that, there was people who swore what's called a trustus et fidelis, giving their trust, pledging themselves in body and say soul, but in fidelity towards a king, that they are never going to meet. They are never going to the royal palaces, but the king sent envoys on their behalf who carried their power. That being said, doing some of this, like I said, we have to reconstruct, we have to retro-engineer things, and we also have to take all of the the tradition that we have, or that we can glean from textual evidence, and kind of compress it down to a microcosm so that we can adopt certain ways and live rightly today. And so, I mean, if you have a little group of 4 or 5 people, I mean, are you really this large Frankish nation? No, but you can be a smaller group forming a what would have been basically a huiski, a settlement, but still living under that extended ancient law. And you can swear your fealty or pledge yourself to the king, although the king, as I said, is dead, but he becomes hidden and still has power. That's a little more of the kind of religious. There's a lot of belief that has to go into that and so on. But I feel that it's right, and it's a unique characteristic, an important characteristic of Frankish heathenry.
Well, we're rapidly running out of time here. Eric, I do want to thank you for joining. Any last thoughts? One thing I'd like you to talk about, if you have any thoughts on it, is the unique blend of German and Roman that emerges, from which the French emerges, seems to me, as an outsider looking in, something that's also uniquely Canadian with that English and French blend, or not even blend. It's not. These are two parallel structures that have created something that's unique, yet still remaining very independent in terms of culture and identity.
Okay, so very quickly, because I know we're running out of time, we do have two, and it's been recognized, we have two parallel nations, which constitute, and I say nations, I mean, colonial European nations, because there's a lot of First Nations that came together, and, it does make for some difficult times. I mean, once people can get past kind of the politics of it all, it really does work out. I mean, I grew up as, my father is an Anglophone, by language, and my mother was Francophone, and, living on the Quebec side, it was difficult, and I always identify with the minority. I was more of an Anglo-Quebecer when I was in Quebec, but now that I'm in Ontario, I'm more of a Franco-Ontarian, and by definition, I am both. If you look at, the various definitions of what, an Anglo-Quebecer and what a Franco-Ontarian would be, but I'm also French-Canadian, French, going back to 1669, but I'm also got a lot of Irish component too, so it becomes all about negotiating. And what I think that draws into Frankish Heathenry is that Frankish Heathenry, as I mentioned, ethnicity was fluid in that burgeoning state, or that burgeoning nation, and there was a lot of negotiating that was going on, and every little region was different. And I know for myself, growing up, I had to negotiate certain things. At this moment in time, I identify as this. At this moment in time, I identify as that. And it's a continual thing. And everybody here whose parents are, one's English and one's French, you have that kind of dual personality, or that dual identity. And I think that matches 100% perfect with Frankish Heathenry, because you have, the Germanic side and the Romanitas, and it blends together, it becomes this hodgepodge mix kind of thing, and the only thing we can really go by is law codes and structures. And if we live by the same, social laws, by the same, archaic Frankish law, then we can identify as Franks.
Eric, thank you so much. I truly appreciate you taking the time to come out. This has been really interesting. I can't wait to talk to you again. It's definitely going to happen. You do have a Facebook group on Frankish Heathenry. We'll include a link to that. And we'll also include some links to the books that you mentioned and the authors that you've cited in today's conversation.
I've got a few of them.
Awesome. Thanks again. Have a great night. I'll see everybody later. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
So that was quite the interesting interview, actually. And I do believe we're all back now. Can everybody hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Yeah, it looks like the only one still muted is Toby, and I'm sure he's just fixing things up on his end. That was a really interesting interview. I mean, as it went on, I started to get a real sense of what it is he's building. He's taken on a hell of an undertaking. So I really was glad to hear that interview.
Moving right along, I guess. Toby, can you go ahead and introduce our other guests for us and give us the rundown there?
Sure. So we have two guests today, both Canadian heathens living in central Canada, mid-Canada. We have Austin Lawrence of Ravensknoll, and again, Martin Heitschu. And I'm sorry, Martin, I didn't catch who you're affiliated with, if anyone.
I'm affiliated with Nine Mountains Kindred in the Montreal region.
Excellent. I've actually heard very good things about y'all from Eric. So welcome to the program. Welcome to the program, and let's go ahead and just get started. So let's Martin, why don't we start with you? Why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself, your group, and what you think makes Canadian Heathenry unique in the Western Hemisphere?
That's a loaded question because I'm not too sure what other folks are doing in other parts of the continent except bicker on Facebook and on the internet. But hereabouts in these parts, it's all pretty much a new thing. I'm not, despite my age, I came to heathenry kind of late in life. It's only been about 5 or 6 years that I've been actively involved. But in that time, I got pretty excited about it, and I met Eric. He was one of the first heathens that I met, and I was determined to start a kindred in Montreal, which I did. I'm a founder of Nine Mountains Kindred, one of the founding members. And we've grown over the years. Over the last 4 years, we've got members come and go, and right now we've got a nice solid core group of oath members, and we like to get out of the city, we like to get out of the urban areas, and we're hikers. So we do all of our bloats and all of our ceremonies on the tops of the Montérégion hills. And we sort of go for, not necessarily, our attestation of this is more in Slavic Radnavry, where they worshipped with god poles and things on top of hills and bald mountains. And since we have those, our particular geographical features of our region, we thought it would be a really cool idea to, and it was quite a coincidence also that there are actually 9 of them, you know. So we named our kindred after that geological fact, and our tradition in our particular group is to honor the ancestors and the northern pantheon from those hilltops.
Okay. Now, one thing I am familiar with. Sorry, we're getting a little bit of feedback from Thorin. Can you put yourself on mute?
Sure can.
Okay, so Martin.
Seattle tops.
So Martin, your group, and before we get to introduce Austin, your group has a really interesting membership dynamic. You mentioned that you have the 9 hills or 9 mountains surrounding Montreal. Can you tell us a little bit about like that piece? Like I'm given to understand that full members of your kindred have to hike and gift to the Wita of all 9 mountains before you're considered part of your group. Is that correct, or am I?
That is a feature of our newly developed charter that we've been working on the last bit. We decided that it was a good frith building exercise. We want our members to be active citizens. We want them to be in relatively good shape, and we want them to be able to organize and conduct themselves in a manner that's fitting to what the rest of the group sees. If you can organize yourself over the course of a year to go and hike and climb 9 mountains with a few of the members, and to get to know them and to get to know each other and experience mutual hardship and the goals that come with those endeavors, we feel it's a good way to build strong bonds amongst people, and we're open to anybody who's crazy enough to try it.
Oh, I think it's awesome. I definitely do think that group dynamics are built on shared experiences, and this is one way to make everybody has gone through these processes. It's definitely one way to do it. I've seen other groups do it different ways.
I'd like to say, just add to that quickly, that we came to that realization, Argothi and I came to that realization after attending a major heathen festival in the region at Ravensknoll, where Oz is steward. That was a very powerful first event, the first heathen main hail and horn gathering, and we were inspired by the raising of the Odin god pole to come up with a task that would be truly worthy of our experience there, and that's where we came up with that idea: to climb 9 mountains. Let's just climb them all, you know. And we did it. We oathed to do it in a year, and we accomplished that oath. And other people were inspired by those events, and our membership has grown, and we've attracted a new oath member who liked to hike, who liked to get out and liked to do that, and who happened to be a heathen and was looking for other heathens who liked to hike. And it was like, well, you found the right place, man. Come on, you know. It was awesome.
Well, Thank you, Martin. That actually brings us into a great segue to introduce Austin Lawrence, Oz. Oz, who are you, and what's your group, and what are you about?
Well, I don't actually belong to any kind of formal kindred. My role is a bit different. I am one of the owners of Ravens Knoll. It's a campground at which pagan and heathen events take place. So essentially an established location in which to practice heathen religion. I was involved previous to that with the organization of the Kaleidoscope Gathering, which is Canada's largest pagan gathering. So my roots are from the festival, pagan festival gatherings. And we put down Ravens Knoll as a place for multiple different communities, whether they be traditional witches, druids of different stripes, Angach Ben, or heathen groups, which of course heathenry is my own tradition. And around 6 years ago, we purchased land of 100 acres, my wife and I, and we fund the land and the sacred spaces that are there through the events that we run and the Kaleidoscope Gathering that is held there. But also, too, around 5 years ago, Eric and I and a number of others got together and founded the Hail and Horn Gathering in order to bring what we felt was a more historical and authentic expression of heathenry to Canadians, and try to bring various different heathen groups together that don't necessarily get along online or throughout the year, but get them together for powerful experiences at least once a year.
Okay, very cool. So, I asked Martin the same question. What do you feel is the defining pieces of Canadian heathenry? What makes heathenry in Canada unique from, say, the Northeast? I know you've mentioned you've had some talks with Northeast heathens in the past.
Well, part of it may be a little bit biased to my experience, but it's that we have a connection to the wider pagan community, probably a lot more. We don't mind calling other types of pagans or witches friends. They're often our family members or our close kith. For instance, a Runiter kindred, Eric's kindred, about half the people who show up don't necessarily identify as heathen. And at Ravens Knoll, the people who sit at Sumbul and under the Ravens Knoll banner, the majority of them don't identify as heathen, although they like to practice heathen custom and respect it and learn from it. They are there because they contribute at the work weekends at Ravens Knoll or our staff or other types of events as well. So we tend to be extremely inclusive, I'd have to say. Canadian heathens, some of our groups have done a bit better getting along with people who practice Northern tradition paganism, which some may not identify as heathenry, but we have some friends, some of us have friends, and we try to keep people getting along. We also have a lot more connections probably in our day-to-day practice of heathen groups with First Nations practices. For instance, my wife is actually, she doesn't identify as heathen, but she's from a heathen household. She's Mohawk ancestry and practices a mixture of First Nations and sort of pan-pagan Celtic paganism. So I'd say we're probably a little bit more diverse in the way that we practice and in the social structures we seem to have put together for ourselves. But we're also extremely interested in research and doing things that seem historically authentic to us.
So I've got to ask a question for both of our guests. How has native knowledge and native practice affected things in your region of the country, affected heathen practice in your region of the country?
You mean North American native?
Yes.
I can't say it's affected very much, other than perhaps a higher regard for nature or a closer desire to be closer to the land or something, more romantic kind of sense. But I don't think it had a huge impact. I tend to get my spirituality more from I don't know, from my ancestors, just from my family, from the people that I knew, or the actual feeling that I get from the ground that I've lived on. I've been in this area, lived in Montreal for 35 years now, and it's my home. So whatever energies or powers I get from that sort of define my spirituality more than something native or something like that.
Yeah, and I don't mean that sort of it's an overarching influence. Like, you'll see it most often, perhaps, in offerings for the land whites. So, for instance, land whites, people often up here often give them tobacco or some of the four sacred medicines of the medicine wheel that's practiced by the Anishinaabe people who live around here. So, a lot of them say, well, this white has been receiving these offerings longer of this type, so I've given them beer and I've given them mead, but in this area it doesn't seem to work out so well, so I'm going to go back to what they're probably more used to. And they didn't do so well with whiskey during colonialism, so it's like you might want to give them tobacco again. So there's a little bit of that, especially with the whites. And there's a bit of some people have seen a few comparisons between some First Nations practice and some of the larger gatherings. So, for instance, the use of traditional foods, for instance, sacralizing traditional foods in practice, which is our practice in Husserl at Hail and Horn Gathering, is very related to the eating of bush foods and local foods and the foods of the ancestors, which is something that's done in native practice, especially amongst the Haudenosaunee, the Longhouse people. And the primacy given to women, to obviously the role of women and the important role in ritual and in leadership positions pops up in a lot of heathen groups, but it also happens to pop up very strongly in Haudenosaunee, like Iroquoian people's traditions as well. So there's a little bit of influence there. It just happens to be that there's a bunch of people who come that happen to be First Nations ancestry as well. So they just bring that flavor to some of the groups. Maybe not the ones in Montreal, but maybe closer to at Ravensnowell or Toronto or some London area, right?
Right.
One of the things that happens quite often, at least in the United States, is heathens and pagans don't tend to get along. Does that dynamic translate in Canada as well? Do you guys run across issues of communication or just some bad blood between the general pagan community and the heathen community?
I haven't run across very much of it here in Montreal. It's most people here are either Catholic, Protestant, or there's very, very few pagans that I've met, or heathens for that matter, and I think people tend to stick together. There's not a lot of opportunity for different pagans and heathens to mix, other than at a big gathering like at Ravensnowell or something like that, or at Kaleidoscope Fest in Ontario. But in Montreal, I'm not familiar with too many. I usually go out of town to meet other heathens, and we gather in the countryside, and where we go, it's normally just tourists or the occasional hiker, but we rarely see other pagans or other people. Most people don't know what we're doing there either, although we rarely get any trouble from anybody here. Nobody ever interferes or bothers us, even though we do most of our rituals in public spaces.
Yeah, I find that if people just come to heathenry through an online interaction rather than meeting people in person, they tend to have more problems with other types of pagans. If they actually meet them in person and they realize they're different for certain, but they might be part of a continuum, they don't have as many problems. And also too, I've been around in the pagan community for about 20 years, and I've seen a lot of people move from just interest in heathenry and sort of not really understanding things historically, and eventually they become good heathens, right? And where are you going to get your good heathens? It's much more likely that you're going to get it from another pagan community or community of seekers who may or may not be what you consider to be fluffy bunnies, right? So, there's no reason to alienate them, and we're all trying to recreate something authentic and useful for ourselves. Heathenry may not be for everybody, but they still may be good people doing the stuff, right? So, I don't know. I found, since like I said, I'm basically biased. I try to make people get along with the role I play in larger festivals and gatherings, And because of almost everything I do is focused on that from May until the end of October, I don't get to do much small group heathenry. It's household heathenry or huge events writ large, right? That's my life.
Well, cool. Thanks for answering. I have a question, and I'm going to pose it to both of you. The climate that you find yourself in, very far north, can be very harsh. I mean, I've seen pictures of Montreal winters. They're nothing to mess around with. So, in what manner does your particular bioregion and climate region have an impact, if any, on what you do? I mean, a perfect example of this that I would use is Yule in the southeast. It's very the emphasis is on travel and companionship, perhaps because it's so easy for us to move around because it's only cold. There's not a lot of snow. If it's ice, nobody goes anywhere, but that happens about once every 20 years.
Right.
In what way does this happen? Does this impact what you guys do in terms of the wheel of the year?
Yule for us is an interior event. It's the one major gathering every year where it's guaranteed to be indoors. It's usually a feast at a table in some place that's nice and cozy and warm. Winter, it's the time for Uller. It's the time for all the fans of Skadi. They're all intensely happy when it's freezing cold. And winter's very special here. It can have a profound effect on your spirituality and your outlook in life. When your year's cut in half, 6 months of freezing your butt off and then 6 months of sweating, it can affect the way you see nature, and it can affect the way you see social gatherings. We tend to be more insular and more hibernate more in the winter. We tend to be more gregarious and extroverted in the summer when everybody's outdoors for the short summer. We tend to party a lot. Montreal's a crazy party city in the short summer, and then everybody hibernates all winter again, right? Mm-hmm. So it makes things quiet and more mutual and more compact in the winter months. We try to do a hike every winter just to get out there and, it's a face nature and experience a bit of hardship. I always find a winter hike to be an exhilarating experience. But it's not something we can organize every week or very often, and usually people tend to hibernate. Or you do constructive stuff. You spend the winters, we spend the winters fabricating, making shields and making banners and working that kind of thing, so that when summer does come about, we can get out and be in nature.
Yeah, and brewing mead over the winter too, so you can drink it during the summer. Right?
Yeah, definitely there are members who brew mead too over winter. Definitely.
So, Oz, do you want to?
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree with Martin. Sorry, I keep calling him Martin. Je veux parler en français, donc ça c'est le problème. So yeah, I absolutely agree. And me personally, I barely even see the people who sit with me under the Ravens Knoll banner all winter. I may speak to them online. And regarding heathen events, not at all. It becomes just focused on the household, right? At that point, for basically between October, I might have from time to time, I might do Thorbload or something like that. Throw a party in February, usually around that kind of time. But that only, that's not a regular occurrence. I may attend events of some other kindreds just because I'm jonesing for a little bit of high heathen ritual. So I may attend maybe a Runeterra event or another Mabelheim event or some sort of other type of event from another kindred. And just one thing I want to note to you guys, though, but we're in the far south of Canada, right? Both of us live near the American border, so we're south. So our winters are not hard, right? Northern Ontario, Nunavut, those are I have a good friend who's from the Yukon. And she talks about, about tundra and real winter as being part of her spirituality. Coming down here is like, it's just like postcard winter for her, right?
Well, Austin, it's all about perspective. I live in the far north of the United States, awfully close to the border with BC. It's an easy jaunt for me to go up there. But we still don't really get to a point in our year where we can't do at least part of our ritual outside. Outdoor events is pretty integral to most heathens in the Cascadian region, and even my tribe's Yule feast is both indoor and outdoor at the same time. The pig is always cooked outside, which means there's a good chance that a significant portion of the gathering is taking place outside, and it's really just sort of in and out all night.
Well, and just to give you a touch of perspective, I'm in Eugene, and about 2 years ago we had an ice storm where we got maybe 3/4 of an inch of ice around all of our trees, and the entire town shut down.
Yeah.
Well, we're on the wet side of Cascadia. A little bit of snow or ice pretty much shuts everybody down. They're not used to it.
Yeah. Well, for me though, you're asking me these questions about what the bioregion means. I find it extremely strange. Like, I don't know if I could even practice heathenry in a desert, because I have this experience of an actual basically a 2-seasonal change. Like, Canada has a little bit of fall, barely any spring, really. You're basically dealing with a summer period, a bit of a fall, and a winter, right? And if you look back to historical sources from Iceland, some of the Scandinavian sources, you're following basically the same seasonal pattern. And in the mythology, you have trees, you have elk, you have deer, you have squirrels, you have boars, you have everything that survives in my region right here, right between temperate forest. We're right between temperate forest and deciduous forest, right, on the Canadian Shield, at least with Ravenstone and Ottawa area, and it matches very well with the sources that I look to most in the reconstruction of my religious tradition. And maybe people could find Thor in the desert, or like, where do you find Scatty in the desert? Maybe if you're shooting with a bow, how are you gonna have a snowshoe or skiing god? Well, do you do it if you got inline skates, or I don't know how it works. So, how do you find that personal connection unless you're like cross country skiing or snowshoeing or something?
I think Josh and I can definitely commiserate with you. We have 2 seasons in the Cascadia, or Western Cascadia as well. It's raining and not raining.
Yeah,
basically.
That's very much like Northern Germany. Northern Germany is like Vancouver weather or Seattle weather. It's very wet and very rarely freezes in the winter. I grew up as a kid in Northern Germany, and then I came to Canada. And here the winters are much more brutal. But like Oz was saying, the landscape is very close to heart, because my ancestors came from the Bavaria, which is in the foothills of the Alps, and that region is kind of similar to the Appalachian Mountains, or perhaps you could say the Laurentian Mountains north of Montreal. The fact that we have it's a hillier region than Ontario, Quebec is. There's a lot of similarities geographically with where my ancestors came from too that I could relate to.
Well, I mean, to respond to Oz there with how do you do heathen in the desert? The answer is things adapt. In Iceland, for example, you don't get the thunderstorm Thor. You get Thor that brings the rain. And yeah, if you're a heathen in Arizona, you're probably not going to be spending a lot of time with Njörður as the god of the sea. You're going to be emphasizing his trade aspects and his travel aspects. That's what happens. I mean, and it grows, and it's dynamically grown, and as long as we're authentic and as long as we pursue it with a level of authenticity and faith, we'll eventually drift apart. You'll be able to see, in much the same way that originally there was this Proto-Indo-European religion, but it eventually drifted apart into the northern religion, the southwest of Rome, the south of Greece, and the southeast of the Vedics. But you can still see the common elements among all three. It's an interesting thing to me, and one of the reasons why we are so dedicated to this regional heathenry series that we've been doing, and so excited to have y'all on, is to talk to different heathens from different regions and how do you heathen. So I do want to thank you for that, and what I'd like to do is ask you, like, from an outsider perspective, and this is one of the things that I asked Eric in his interview. And I mean, what do you think the Canadianness? I saw a little bit of it from an outsider's perspective, and again, if please don't be offended, but I saw it in the get along attitude that Oz emphasized between pagans and heathens in general. That's not an American trait. We like a good fight. That's something uniquely American. So I'll start with you, Martin. How do you feel that being Canadian has influenced being a Canadian heathen?
I think that's a really good question, and it's one that sort of rack your brains over trying to come up with an answer, because unless you've traveled wildly or unless you have a lot of experience with the different ways heathenry is practiced in North America, I wouldn't know how to define it. For us personally, we have strife like anyone else has strife, but it seems to be more internal within kindreds and within small groups as opposed to amongst larger groups. I think heathenry is still burgeoning. It's still pretty rare up here and few and far between, and its presence on the internet is perceived as one thing, but its actual presence on the ground, in the field, in other words, is another. I find that things are a little more polemic in the States, or at least that's my perception of things from up here, looking down, or looking across the border. I find that seems to be a lot of controversies and a lot of things. When you read about, I read about recently about controversies whereby the Icelanders were getting hate mail from the States, and it was causing an international incident, and blah blah blah. And it was like, I know personally that doesn't represent all of American heathenry, and I know it's vocal minorities doing all of this noise, but it seems to be coming from down there more than from other places. So that is something I perceive, but how has it affected us up here? How are we doing things differently? I don't know. We're all just trying to cope. We're all learning. We're all just trying to make it work for each of our own tribes, and we got a good thing going up here. It's working for us, and we're happy to share what works for us with others, and we don't concern ourselves too much with all the noise.
Thank you very much. Oz, do you have anything?
Lesson that American heathens should learn. I really do. I admire that.
One of the problems is there's probably too many American heathens, right? Like Canadians, there's just less of us, right? Like we have as many people in the whole country as in California, right? Just like all as numbers, and we're spread out in a geography that's way larger than yours. And like that heathen census that was done online, not exactly a representative sample, but it's not just under 900 heathens in Canada, right? Now, the Hail and Horn gathering, we get like upwards of 80 people. Not everybody identifies as heathen. So that's probably the largest, we're getting, it's just about 850. We're getting around 1/10 of the heathen population, roughly, of Canada coming to that event. And they're from all sorts of different stripes, right? So there are all sorts of different traditions. You have one group one kindred that's mainly focused on ex-military and metalheads. You have Martin's group, which is a high proportion of francophones, really outdoorsy. They interact directly with nature. You have more intellectual groups that are household focused, like the Runetir, that come together under banners. You have my group, which is essentially general pagan and heathen focused community service, producing actual vays and godfolds, etc., so that we can honor the gods directly in the old ways. You have all these, and you even have a group that's more mystical, northern tradition, right? And if you tried to divide them up and have events, you'd only be being with like 5 people in your living room, right? If you want to actually produce heathenry and community, you're gonna have to work on your differences and try to focus on your similarities and create bonds of friend, not just really, really close bonds of loyalty and fealty that you do with your kin members in your own kindred, but actually try to build a heathenry that can be robust for newcomers, others, so that they can find you, right? And I think a lot of the smaller groups recognize that their own insular and practice and their own thews and their own practice has to be opened up a bit more, because if they look at their own history, how would they have ever come to heathenry if they hadn't had an open person allow them in? Or if there wasn't an event where they could just say online, I actually want to meet somebody, and not just read books in my basement, but actually, raise a horn to the gods and speak to them with others. So I don't know. It's just sort of going on. It's just again, it's the try to get along attitude, I guess. Not to say that there aren't groups, there's Odinists in Alberta that stay totally apart from the rest of the heathens. 1 or 2 groups of racists in southern Ontario, but they don't.
So that actually brings up we have a great question that kind of plays off of that from our token Brazilian in the audience. His name he's called Marcel. He says, keeping in mind that Canadians are always nice and polite. Again, we're talking in stereotypes. Do Canadian Christians annoy the Canadian heathens a lot, or are they more respectful? What is your what's your
dynamic?
Yeah, that dynamic aside from pagans and heathens, what's your dynamic with the overculture?
People up here don't talk about their religion. It's a private matter. People rarely come up. You don't come up to a stranger on the streets of Montreal and say, "What's your faith?" or something like that. It would not be healthy. People rarely ask. I always wear my Mjolnir, and maybe once in a blue moon, someone asks me, "What is it?" People rarely try to convert me. No one's preaching. No one's proselytizing. There are a few Jehovah's Witnesses going door to door in certain places, but I can honestly say in 35 years in the big city that I've seen very little proselytization of any sort. People stick to their own up here. People have their own places of worship. There are all kinds of temples. There are Buddhist temples, Hindu temples, Christian temples, Jewish temples, Arab temples. There's temples of every kind on the island, and people pretty much stick to their own. I have seen very little religious beefs of any sort. No one's ever said, "Oh, you're going to hell," or "You're doing this because you're wearing a cross," or "You're a demon," or I've never really run across that at all, and that to me is largely an aspect of internet heathenry. It's not something I experience in my day-to-day life.
That's really interesting, because where I'm from in Georgia, I could tell you all about you by where do you go to church, son?
Really?
I've experienced that in Appalachia, but not so much in Cascadia.
Yeah, I'd have to agree with Martin. Canada is much more. We have essentially the state ideology of multiculturalism, not the melting pot. And this came from the initial two European nations that settled and treated with many different First Nations, right? So our colonial experience and our national identity is just constructed differently, and that ethnic element rolls over into religion to some degree. So there's a lot less proselytizing to start. There are extreme religious groups, though, in Canada, but they've directed their ire mainly at the Wiccan community and the wider pagan community because of the satanic panic, etc., that started in the 80s, went into the 90s, and sort of pops up every now and then. we at the Kaleidoscope gathering, for instance, can't remember when it was 10 years ago or something. We had an evangelical Christian church picketing the festival, and we brought them lemonade and said hello, and we got interviews in the newspaper, and more people came the next year, right? Like that's how it works. But heathenry is so under the radar, or for that matter, any of the reconstructed polytheistic religions, that people have no clue what it is in the general population. And the sort of the nasty evangelical Christian groups that would normally be trying to convert you or think you're devils just haven't really sort of tagged on to the concept that we're here yet.
Right. So, sorry, do you have something, Josh?
Yeah, I've been directed to ask a question that delves deeply into some stereotypes. What's your favorite hockey team, and why is it the Boston Bruins? As you can tell, Americans are big on Canadian stereotypes, and I would like to apologize for it, but we do get some humor out of it.
I think the worst part about that question is it has nothing to do with curling.
Well, I don't know. I actually am a Canadian who doesn't watch hockey. I don't follow any hockey. Maybe I'm not Canadian. Maybe it's my mother's from Denmark. I don't know. Like I don't follow any hockey. I just don't have time for it.
This is the part where you apologize for that, right?
No, I'm not going to apologize because I see fanaticism for sports teams as a replacement for the tribalism of our ancestors, and I've got tribalism, right? Like, and I'd rather practice a sport and I practice arnis, or I used to do Germanic two-handed sword fighting. I'd rather cheer for one of my buddies at a tournament, getting the crap beat out of him with sticks, than some sort of dude who's from another city who's just been paid a lot to come to yours to beat someone up with sticks. You know, I want it to be my neighbor, right? So kind of like they have with, I guess, hurling in Ireland, right? The hurlers have to be from that city. Now, I can get behind a professional sport where everyone has to be from the same city. Like, it just seems so cheap to me that, you know, everyone, like the Boston Bruins, how many of those guys are Canadian? Like, 75%?
Yeah.
Right? I don't know. It's just a philosophy of professional sports bugs me. I'd rather just play sports.
No, awesome. I'm right there with you. I've talked to people before about how, the sports fanaticism is just, another form of tribalism in the modern day. You know, people who don't really even know much about the sport or give a crap about it are all about, go team when they're representing their area well. So, it would be sort of interesting if there was rules like that about them being locals.
Yeah. Yeah, and then for instance, like soccer teams in Europe, they're not allowed to move out of that area. They can hire people from other places, but they can't move. But like what was it, the Mighty Ducks? Like you have a corporation that buys a hockey team, moves it to a place with no ice ever, and then brands it with a movie, like a cartoon movie. Like how is that hockey? I don't know. That just seems very strange. Maybe I'm a hockey purist in some degrees, but I'm like a purist like I am with my religion. I want to go back to sort of the way sport should be authentically done in order to have a spiritual or meaningful experience from it, not some sort of corporate, shill to get your cash. Rah, 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 we're from the same city.
Well, I'd like to pitch it in, apologize for Oz. Montreal is like the birthplace of hockey. It's like our national religion. There's shrines to hockey here. There's hockey fanatics everywhere. People eat, sleep, and breathe hockey here. But like Oz, I'm not particularly a big hockey fan either. And I don't follow it religiously, or I go for the home team when they're in the Stanley Cup and all of that because it affects the whole city and my ability to move around in it. But other than that, no, I don't really follow organized sports all that much.
Our producer is a huge Boston Bruins fan, and you can blame him for the question.
It had to be asked.
No, I come from the same place. Nothing made me hate football more than living in a college football town. it's impacted my quality of life. I'm done with it. Anyway,
I got to be honest. The sports teams, despite the fact that recently my city has had 2 world-class sport teams just suddenly come out of nowhere and be good, it really hasn't affected my quality of life all that much. I mean, I live north of Seattle, I work south of Seattle, I have to drive through downtown twice a day, but the traffic really hasn't been an effect for me, so I just say go team, and then mostly ignore it after that.
I have, however, seen some excellent toasts to hockey teams at Sumble, though, especially the ones that are losing badly. So I've mainly seen toasts to the Toronto Maple Leafs, and they've been definitely overrepresented at Sumble. It's almost like prayers rather than toast, perhaps, but yeah.
See,
fair enough.
I live right down the street from the stadium in Eugene where the Ducks play, so I feel Martin's pain. When the Ducks are in town, I don't even leave my house. There's no point.
So I've got you. If you don't have another question, I thought of a question for you guys as Americans. We see there's been all this stuff on the internet with the McNallen and group buying a building, right? And we had recently the big kerfuffle over Iceland having its building atop. They had buildings before, but no one seemed to have pointed that out. We obviously, we at Ravens Knoll in the last 5 years have an outdoor bay that's publicly available to everyone. Now, with so many heathens in the States, why haven't you done more building of community centers, bays, public, etc.? Like, is it the function of what you were talking about before, and people can't get along and they're fighting, or what's up with that?
So this, my knowledge comes from an episode of Raven Radio that happened several years back, but neither McNallen's thing or the Icelandic thing is the first modern heathen temple anywhere.
No.
There are a few buildings, actually, in the United States that have been repurposed specifically for heathen worship and are available to the public as libraries and whatnot. The one specifically I can think of is in the Midwest here in the United States, where a kindred got together and bought a house. But for the most part, our groups tend to be really insular, and so when we have a building, we don't share it with everybody. McNallen is an exception because he has a national organization, and so he kind of has to share. So that's what I see it as.
I mean, I'll say from the point of view, and this is not by any means a universal ideal, but there are a lot of groups out there that have their own buildings or that want their own buildings, their own temples, and they will be the first to say, and the same as my tribe would say, if my tribe builds a temple, it is not going to be open to the public. And if people know about it, it's probably going to be because, I'm saying, look how great my tribe is. We built a temple. And it's basically a concept of keeping our sacred because there's so many varied groups out there that either aren't holding to a similar thew to us, or who are just people we would just as soon not mix our luck with by having them worship in our sacred or profane our sacred with their presence, if that makes sense.
No, it makes sense. One of the interesting things at the Knoll is that we have the Bay, and we have pretty particular rules about going in the Bay and what you should and shouldn't do in that place. And people have been remarkably respectful, no matter whether heathen or other traditions. Even people who had a large pagan gathering like the Kaleidoscope, which goes up to like 1,000 people. People who we have on the radar for security have been respectful of the rules, even though we thought they might not have. It's been.
Well, and I do want to point out that we may not have a lot of public temples and buildings and stuff, but we do love our events. We recently had Lightning Across the Plains cancel, and 3 different events sprung up to take care of that. Toby, Thorin, and I are putting on an event. There's Troth Moot. There's all sorts of events going on all the time. Just usually in
Summerstowe was
public
a month ago.
campgrounds.
Yeah. The reason I'm mentioning Kaleidoscope specifically is because Raven's Knoll has the permanent permanent god poles, permanent Veibonder set up, right? So, and it has this, and it's used as the site and focus of the bloat ritual at Hail and Horn Gathering. But it is used throughout the year by anyone who respects the Thu of the holy site. And as you were mentioning of the worry about others profaning it, they can go there, and the gods themselves are the ones protecting their holy powers, right? And the people have been very respectful, and we don't have to mix our luck with them, because we don't have to sit at Sumbul with them or actually perform the bloat rites. They are doing it separately in the holy space that we've set up. So I haven't felt like after 6 years of, well, five years now, I guess, of 4 years, sorry, of the Hail and Horn Gathering of doing this. It hasn't been a major. We haven't had a major incident yet.
That's fair. I think the mixing of the luck piece is something that is unique, not uniquely, but definitely that is emphasized by the American tradition. I think there's a uniquely American. Well, I'll have my own blackjack, or I'll do my own casino with blackjack and hookers. You know, I'm gonna take my ball and I'm gonna do my own thing. And I mean, that's not just a heathen thing. That's a uniquely American thing. I mean, the history of evangelicalism, aside from the 20th century piece, but if you look at the history of like 18th and 19th century evangelical Christianity in America, it's just one schism after another schism after another. You know, you have the First Baptist Church, and then you have the Second Baptist Church, and we're going to be the Third Baptist Church. No, we're not. We're going to be the Hill Baptist Church, or we're going to be the Smithville Baptist Church, and they're all from the same Baptist Church. They just have differences of opinion, and sometimes rather than figuring it out, we just say, "Screw you guys! I'm gonna go do my own thing."
It's that stubborn individualistic streak we have.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, certainly, and I mean you can't take away from the fact either that it does seem to have been largely Americans that were talking about the things they would do to properly consecrate the Icelandic temple. And, you know, with folks like that running around in our local neighborhood, I'm not terribly confident about opening up any sacred space I would have to people that I don't know very well.
Well, they obviously don't travel that far, because Canada's not that far from them, so they haven't shown up at our place yet. So,
yeah, but that would require them to get a passport, which means they have to be fingerprinted, which means they have to be in a record somewhere.
They can't
not
carry
gonna
across the border, right? So,
Right.
Okay. Any other questions for our guests?
Have we gotten anything through the IRC recently?
I haven't seen anything pop up. I do really want to extend my appreciation. You guys coming on the show means a lot to all of us. You know, especially broaching that international border for the first time for the show is really important.
Yes, we have international guests.
Well, I appreciate it. I love speaking to you and listening to your other shows and hearing how your heathenry goes on. I haven't been very active online. I joined AL around the same time of Eric, but I was looking to actually talk to people about what they did, not what they said you should be doing. And so I ran into a lot of problems because I said, well, okay, I researched this, and these are the shortcuts I had to make because I had to deal with 3 people who didn't believe the same thing, and this is how it worked out. And then you just get shat upon, right, by someone who's basically done nothing, just sat in their living room, read a couple books. And so I had that experience, so I kind of shut up for a while and just read and did my own thing and actually tried to do heathenry in the real world. So, but I know there's a lot of people in a lot of different places doing it, and your show especially expresses the ability to be strongly Reconstructionist and also be really true to a pragmatic understanding of how to bring this religious tradition to the modern world. So I really appreciate being on the show with you guys.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
That was very nicely said, Oz. For myself, I can't say I have any experience with your program. It's news to me. I was surprised to get the invitation, and I'm honored to be here. I think that heathenry for me is more of a hands-on experience. We practice what we preach. We do heathenry. We try to get away from the computer as much as possible and be face-to-face. And we were actively engaged in going to these gatherings, meeting other heathen in other provinces. We forgot to mention good contacts that we have with folks out in Calgary at Clearwater Kindred. So we are, trying to make this a national thing, and the opportunity to reach out and speak with American heathens face to face, even if it's on a computer, is a welcomed opportunity. Thanks.
Well, we do have 4 minutes left in the show, and we had, I mentioned to you guys earlier that Thorin, Toby, and I are putting on an event.
Yes.
And we had a very important milestone get reached recently. Thorin, when is Cascadia Moot?
Cascadia Moot is May 20th through 22nd of 2016. We've got the site and the date confirmed. It's going to be in Granite Falls, Washington, as we've mentioned a couple times, the Masonic Family Campground. The Masons up there have been dealing with people that I know for 2 decades now. They're wonderful people. And their site is absolutely beautiful. And one thing that I've been talking about with Josh and Toby is I'm going to try to get some pictures available pretty soon, either take a trip up there and take some pictures for you guys, or just get some friends of mine that have been going there with their cameras for the last 20 years to send me their pictures so you guys can see what it looks like. It hasn't changed much.
So, on that note, Toby, the
Yes.
registration's $50. What are people getting for their money?
Okay, so you get your registration, you get your food taken care of. We have a limited amount of sleeping arrangements that we're trying to reserve first and foremost for people with special needs, but they will be available. There's plenty of campgrounds. There are outdoor refrigeration and food storage, so there's plenty of storage to bring your own snacks and your own beer. What else is there, Thorin? Am I missing anything? There's outdoor shelters.
There's outdoor shelters, pavilions, gazebos, etc. The whole ground is right on the edge of a river, which any time of year serves as great refrigeration if you just drop your cooler in it. But we are also going to be looking at different things we can provide at different thresholds of pre-registrations. It really just depends on how many of you give us the money so that we can do this, because as we mentioned before, we are not taking any money home at the end of this. We will spend everything.
And I think that's an important point to stress. We're not making money. The only reason you are giving us money is so that we can buy you things. That's it.
Right. So if we get enough people that are pre-registering, we're going to be trying to provide at least 3 half kegs worth of different beers, hopefully homebrewed, and at least Toby and Josh can vouch that it'll be good.
So, guys, do you mind if I shill for the Hail and Horn Gathering for a minute there, too?
No, absolutely.
not.
Go ahead, yeah.
Take the last 2 minutes and pimp your guys' stuff.
Yeah, the Hail and Horn Gathering takes place the closest to the July 1st weekend. That's the long weekend for Canada Day in Canada. And we get people coming from the States from time to time. We'd love to see more of you guys come up. It costs a little bit more to come to Canada, but we have to pay for the land that we're on, the permanent location. We also give gifts of silver arm rings forged in the ancient style every year to people who speak honorable words or do honorable deeds. We also pay artisans to carve the god poles. And at the event, we treat the whole weekend as a ritual. We have the bloat where we raise the god pole, and next year it's going to be Thor. So it should be a very powerful year. It's been interesting. Then we have a whistle feast, all authentic Dark Ages cuisine that we do each year, and then we do a high stumble. So not an American style stumble as we call it in Canada with the 3 rounds, but a more open and formal stumble along Anglo-Saxon or Frankish lines. And we also do an esoteric rite that we experiment with each year, a little bit different as well. And people come from all around. You'll meet a lot of Canadian heathens. We usually get around 80 people or so. It seems to go up a little bit each year. And we'd love to see you July 1st weekend next year to honor Thor and raise his god pole.
Fantastic. Do you have a website or some sort of social media people can go to find that on?
Yeah, absolutely. It's we have the website is www.ravensknoll.com, and don't really, since we do things more last minute, we're really busy. We don't have anything put up for next year, but you can see what we've done in previous years with our program, and we have an extensive presence on Facebook. We have Hail and Horn Gathering. But one of the best places to go is Ravens Knoll, just the group, for all of the different events we do there.
Awesome.
Right.
Martin, do you have any events or anything that you want to tell people about?
We have Nine Mountain Kindred has a public page on Facebook. We don't have a website, but we have a private group on Facebook and a public page on Facebook.
Awesome. So everybody listening, please go to ravensnoll.com and the Nine Mountains Group public Facebook page. Show them some love, and by all means, let them know if you're going to come up for an event to Ravensnoll. I do want to let our guests know we have a traditional sign-off here on the show. It's not directed at you, but you're doing it wrong.
You're not the
boss of me.
Have a good night, everybody.
Let's just get along.